world seems to be split in the jazz segment of last week in terms of listener feedback. Some folks loved it, and some folks are either reserving judgment or not so much. So for those folks that don't love the jazz segment, now's probably the time to tune out. Go ahead and listen to what we're covering next week in the outro right now. But for those who were the lovers of it, I'm going to try to appeal to what people said that they enjoyed, which is talking about the jazz itself and how it sounds. So I'm going to give a very brief bio of Pharoah Sanders, and then we're going to go to school a little bit, and we're going to talk about some of the elements of the jazz that are in this album.
Are you going to play?
Are you guys ready to maybe take a different take?
You're not going to play any clips?
So on our Twitter account, I put up some terms that we're using.
I saw that.
And I put examples of what they sound like. And what I will also do is I will try to put famous songs that utilize these type of techniques that we will talk about, the three of which that are present in this. So if you are listening to this and you want to take a pause, feel free to go to our Twitter account and go ahead and listen. And you can listen to arpeggios. You can listen to glissandos in terms of the music of what's going on. And a couple different things. And we'll talk about some different stuff along the way. And hopefully that proves to be helpful. So, all right. So here's a little bit about Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders was born on October 13th, 1940. He was born as Pharrell Sanders with an F, not the PH as we know for Pharrell Williams later, correct? In Little Rock, Arkansas. He was an accomplished visual artist growing up. He learned to play the clarinet early. He then learned to play the saxophone in high school because, hey, why not, right? And then he was introduced to jazz. Probably the most interesting part about this is that he gets an inspirational band leader who he learns a lot from, and then the band director leaves the school, and Pharoah Sanders, as a student, just takes over the band as the director, as a student at the school. So, which is pretty awesome when you think about it. So yeah, he finishes out his time as a high school student leading the band. I have absolutely no idea, Matt, but I'm sure the experience was quite riveting for him.
That's a love of music right there, just taking over.
I'm going to go ahead and use my historical knowledge here, since he was also in the Jim Crow South, which we're about to talk about him escaping, to say that I don't think there was a lot of free money floating around in the Jim Crow South to, compensate student band leaders. That's probably how he ended up becoming the band leader. So anyway, that leads into, he realizes kind of he's only going to be able to play in certain types of clubs in Arkansas. He's only able to play, I think in Arkansas, he's actually only able to play in black clubs. They don't even have, white patrons in the black clubs as it is in most other places, right? It was a one-way privilege there, right? You know what I mean? Like white folks go to black clubs, but black, folks couldn't always go to white clubs. I think in Arkansas, it was even more segregated, where it was like, black clubs played black music and white clubs played white music, whatever that means. So he realizes that's kind of not what he wants to do. So I'm sure he takes inventory of the world at this point in the early 60s and goes, where can I go? And like many in that era, he decides Northern California, most notably Oakland, is where he's going to stake out his path, as so many before him did in both the Oakland and San Francisco era. He begins playing in interracial clubs for the first time, and he enjoys it. And in one of these other, the same story, Matt, that we told about, was it Roger McGuinn was it Chris Hillman or Roger McGuinn ran into like Graham Parsons in like the line?
It was it was Chris Hillman in a line at a bank. Yes.
At a line in a bank, right? Runs into Graham Parsons here. So while he's playing, he runs into just John Coltrane at one of the shows and just begins playing under the name Little Rock for John Coltrane's band. Okay. Also, while this is going on, he goes to New York City for a slight sojourn in 1961, where he has as they put it, a period of homelessness. And while he's in this homelessness, in another great, you wonder if these things are because of how good a musician he is or just fortuitous, right? He's actually taken in by Sun Ra, who also tells him to take on the name Pharaoh instead of Pharoah, both for the sound and because of the spiritual overtones of how his music sounds. He ends up in Coltrane's group in the mid-1960s, which is not surprising because, as pretty much everybody knows, Coltrane is known for the saxophone. And Pharoah Sanders is also a saxophonist, albeit a different version of the saxophone. And during that time, he becomes known for having multiphonic technique on the saxophone and for his use of overblowing of the saxophone, which, to be quite honest, I would try to explain it, but it's exactly what you think it would be. It's basically when you overblow the saxophone to create sort of a discordant sound. We definitely heard it last week with Eric Dolphy, if you guys remember. You know, he would play his instruments by overblowing at times to create sort of like a free jazz spontaneity in his albums. Now, as we saw in this piece, and if you listen to John Coltrane, there's a lot more discipline in the composition in what Pharoah Sanders does and what John Coltrane did than what Eric Dolphy was doing. It's maybe one way to put it is it's not as free a jazz as the free jazz of Eric Dolphy. But anyway, the style that Pharoah Sanders plays is known as the sheets of sound. That was what he was playing with John Coltrane. And the sheets of sound, and here's where we're going to kind of get into learning a little bit, is sort of a couple different things are built into the sheets of sound. The first is high-speed, quick arpeggios, okay? Now, are you guys familiar with the arpeggio sound?
I remember playing them in band, but I don't remember what they sound like.
So best way to describe arpeggios is the two different examples, right? The first is the beginning of the Star Spangled Banner, okay? So dun, 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 like basically a type of broken chord in which stuff is played in a rising or a descending order.
It's like a
so
scale.
In that case, right?
It's like scales, right? It's like a different way of doing scales.
It is, but you're not playing the full scale, right? You know what I mean? Because you can stay in an area for a little bit and then go up. And you're not going up and then going down, right?
Are they supposed to be improvised, or is that just something that jazz musicians did?
It's something that all musicians do, not just jazz musicians.
Right, but in terms of like, is it
learning how to play?
But is it supposed to be improvised, or is a true arpeggio like have a structure to it in terms of what you're supposed to play?
It's basically it's defined as it's when you play broken chords in which the notes are played or sung, because you can also sing all of these things in a rising or descending order that you can see it peaking up. Okay. Are you familiar with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata? Dun, 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 dun. I'm not doing a great job, but you have to hear it. It's notorious, right? But but if you hear the piano, it's like that haunting thing, and it keeps going up. So I guess if you want to know about arpeggios, right?
Go to Coming Stack's Twitter.
Listen to Coming Stack's Twitter, and probably the one that more people are familiar with, if they're not familiar with Beethoven and a lot of classical music, is the beginning of the Star Spangled Banner, because that's basically the first 30 seconds of the song is an arpeggio. Okay, so he uses tons of arpeggios. There aren't many in Karma, this album, but in Coltrane's work where he's a part of it, they're all over the place. And later in Pharoah Sanders' work, they're also very present. Okay, now there are a fair amount of what are called glissandos in this, and that is the second piece of the sheet of sound approach that Coltrane was using in the mid-60s that basically directly influenced Pharoah Sanders. A glissando is a long-held note that sounds like a long breath out and then a long breath in. So I guess the best way to think of it is, do you think of the trombone, where you hear something with the trombone like, and then
that's
like
a pretty good
back.
trombone, John. You do a better trombone than you do arpeggios.
That I do Beethoven.
Yes,
yes. So rusty trombone versus Beethoven Moonlight Sonata. I'm better with.
Are you good at
trombone.
The rusty trombone?
Okay.
Oh wow.
yeah. So anyway, the glissando. Hopefully that at least gives you a little bit. So what happens is the glissandos they're basically thrown into different stuff, and a lot of times they're used to create depth in open space. Okay, so Coltrane was either giving you open space where he's using glissandos or slight drum beats, right, when he's not playing the sax, and then when he's playing, he's using the sheets of sound for people that we're going to do my favorite things pretty soon, but most people who've ever walked through a Macy's in holiday season have heard John Coltrane's version of My Favorite Things on sax, right. And basically it's the sound of that. Dun, 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 dun. But then like the freestyle part where he starts playing like dun, 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 and notice how there was that rapid up. That is the arpeggio going up, right? You know what I mean? The sound, but it's going up. but and then the glissando would be when you let a note like that sit, inhale, and then exhale, if that makes sense. Okay, so those are two things that are part of the sheet of sound that he was using. Okay, and so then the other thing that we want to talk about, and that you're going to notice, especially in the first piece, the creator has a master plan. Because musically and vocally in that song, you're going to have what's called an ostinato technique of singing or playing. He actually gives both. He starts with the music of it, and then later it becomes basically the vocals of that song. And an ostinato is just a technique of singing that has a repetition of a phrase or a rhythm that gets played continuously to basically build almost up to something more orchestral. So, for example, in the creator has a master plan, right? That's the second one that's coming. That's the vocal one, where there's the creator has a master plan, and it's basically going over and over and repeating itself.
Peace
and
before
love
that, to every man.
Peace and exactly.
Yes, it got in my head.
What you're hearing is. So that piece of music being an extended, 18 music, and it's funny that you say it got in your head, Josh, because it is designed to get in your head. And when used, what the idea is that creates almost like a bass line type of effect, or, a keeping the time drummer type effect. And then what the idea behind it, that Pharoah Sanders was going for, was the other pieces of the instrumentation are supposed to build around it and stand out even more. Because of almost think of it kind of like in meditation with ums and chanting, you know what I mean? And it's designed to kind of quiet your spiritual, psyche kind of, and then you're supposed to have a more heightened consciousness of other stuff, right? And that is not even a bizarre analogy there, because that's kind of what Pharoah Sanders was going for. Because spirituality is built into what he was trying to do in his music.
It's like
before I kind of go in a little bit.
I was gonna say
before I go in a little bit into the thing. What do you guys think, Josh? Go ahead.
Oh, I thought I was ready for this after listening to Eric Dolphy. I was not ready for this. It was.
Oh, it's very different.
Yes,
very different.
Very different. I was very naive, I should say.
Gotcha.
And those overblown horns are like so intense in that song. Oh, we should also say that this album is really only 2 tracks, and the first track is 30 minutes long. So that's a journey unto itself. Listening to that.
You got it. Matt, what are your initial impressions before I kind of get into a little bit of what Mr. Sanders was going for in this album?
My initial impressions are I was so excited to have 2 great albums that I loved and was excited to talk about, and then I got to end on a sad note like I do here, like I did last week. So that's my initial impression.
Gotcha. Well, so what Pharoah Sanders was going for here, many people consider this to be a sequel to John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. Now, it does not sound a lot like A Love Supreme. And it's interesting because both Eric Dolphy and Pharoah Sanders were both highly influenced by John Coltrane, but ended up going kind of in different directions in terms of what they were looking for. Pharoah Sanders' work actually made the charts at different times because it was considered more accessible. I don't think you would see a world where Eric Dolphy was, charting in the top 40 because his free jazz was very different. This was basically an album that was designed to show off Pharoah Sanders, who was considered the best tenor sax player of his era. The music is designed to be almost like a religious experience, and he called it sort of a meditative aesthetic was what he was going for. And he was driven by, most notably, the idea of karma, which I think most people are aware of, the name of this album as well. But karma, the yin and the yang, so to speak. Every action has a reaction, etc. And then Tawhid, which is the concept of the one and single God in the Muslim faith. I cannot do justice to that. It's basically the central idea of Muslim faith. It's also a very esoteric, abstract sort of idea. So if you're interested, you can read in it. But he was basically influenced by both of those ideas. He basically did an album before this. It was called Pharaoh's First. The musicians were playing traditional jazz, kind of like what Coltrane was playing at the beginning of the 60s, if you listen to his stuff. But Sanders was doing solos and playing more free jazz, and basically they realized, like, I'm going to need to bring in some people that are kind of going for my aesthetic. So he brings in a lot of people, who can play his aesthetic. Most notably Leon Thomas, who was the singer, and they say yodeling based singing, especially in the second piece here that we'll talk about. The rest of the pieces of the band are well regarded jazz musicians. You got Lonnie Liston Smith on the piano, which is very much present in this album. Julius Watkins on the French horn, Reggie Workman on the bass, Richard Davis on the second bass. You have a flautist in James Spaulding. You got Billy Hart on the drums, and then there's a general percussionist, in other words, the African percussion, and that's Nathaniel Betts. So that is all of the folks that are on the album. It's really that ostinato technique of singing and structuring throughout as the bass, throwing in some overblowing and glissandos along the way with just periods of time in which Pharoah Sanders is soloing, and that's what you're looking at on these pieces. The second piece has a little bit more traditional singing, I would say, as opposed to the first piece, and not really the use of the ostinatos, and is much shorter as well, chalking into about 5.5 minutes. So there you go. I think you got a little bit of an overview. I won't give my opinion until Josh and Matt have their space. Matt kind of went a little bit more into it, but Josh, you kind of mentioned that it was a different listen. What were your thoughts?
It was definitely different than Eric Dolphy. This was, mission accomplished in terms of it being a meditative album to listen to, because there's a lot of repetition of things. When it first starts out, I was like, okay, I can get into this. It's like pretty easy to listen to, but then it like builds, and the repetition of the creator has a master plan lyric, and then you get the overblown saxophone, I guess, and that is like super intense, and that comes for periods and goes away and then comes back, and it's just, it's unlike anything I've listened to before. I said that last week with Eric Dolphy, but this is completely different stylistically, it seems like. It's free jazz, right, in the same way that Eric Dolphy's free jazz, but I hear those kind of that African sound influence as well in this album. I can't say I enjoyed it. 30 minutes for a song, I tried to listen to it in one sitting and had to even take a break. So I guess it's something you can put on in the background. I'd be interested to try that, actually. Just play it all day and see what happens.
There you go. We're going to have to tape that if that happens and put it on our to be created YouTube channel, Combing the Stacks, because that would be highly entertaining, at least for me. Maybe for no one else, but it would be for me. So, Matt, you kind of gave a little bit of a tell that you weren't necessarily feeling.
Yeah, I absolutely don't want to listen to this all day. Like, that is not happening for me. I will say, first of all, if we're going to be comparing jazz albums, I would say that I enjoyed this more than Eric Dolphy's. It was structured in something, right? The opening track, which really what we're talking about here. I almost feel like that the second song is kind of a throwaway. It's kind of like a crooner lounge. It's almost like a lounge act kind of song where he's just, and I don't know, maybe John, you have more insight onto this later, but he's just naming colors. It's probably a song I could use for my daughter to help her, talk about colors. So I didn't.
Well, it was considered a palate cleanser from the first
and I
song.
can see that.
Was why it was
it's
put on
different.
there.
It's more structured. I felt like, this almost seemed one of two things for me. I listened to it about 3 times, and I think I saw this as kind of a journey, either as like a dream that turns into a nightmare, or like the sequence of somebody's life, because it kind of starts off. I mean, it's a little cacophonous in the beginning, but it's still not. I wouldn't say it was unpleasant. It was still something. It's like, okay, he's just kind of getting into it. It's, there's a lot of percussion in here too. There's a lot of percussive instruments like tambourines, like shakers, like cymbals. It's almost like a consistent rain type, falling throughout a lot of this track. So
it's a great description of the sound.
Yeah,
yep.
It was like very nature, right? You feel like you're out in nature, kind of a thing. So, but if you're starting to fall asleep, it's a little peaceful. You're kind of getting into your groove and stuff, and things are nice. And then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose, and you're just trying to get it because there's just this cacophonous, part towards the end, probably the last third, where it's like 5 minutes of just noise, of panic, of frustration, of and it's not pleasant at all to listen to. And the parts where it is kind of, more pleasant to listen to, it's the same thing over and over again. You have that walking bass line, you have the flute that's going do, 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 over and over again. The vocals.
Well, that's that ostinato, but the music version of it.
Okay, there you go. And then you've got, then you've got.
You get what I'm saying? So
yes.
You could have a music one and a vocal. So he starts with the ostinato of the music. It's almost prime you, and then the vocal comes.
Right. Yeah, and so it's fine, right? It's just long, right? Whereas I wanted the Byrds to go longer with their ideas, this could have been shortened for me, right? So, and then you've got his yodeling, or whatever that is, like
that was crazy too.
Pygmy inspired, and this was direct quote. Pygmy inspired yodeling is what it was described.
That was
as
exactly what I was saying. Pygmy inspired. Yeah, it's just, and it's fine. Like, I don't mind stuff like that. It didn't totally turn me off. So, it just, where I liked it, I just felt it meandered and droned on. Where I didn't like it, I wanted to press, next track, but I can't really do that here. So, I like I said, I do like this better. The Dolphy thing was just, I never really got into that at all. And this I got into a little bit. It was somewhat pleasant, and I don't mind longer songs, Josh. So the 30-minute track didn't bother me. But I also feel like if you're going to go that long, you got to do a little bit more that's going to bring me in. And this, to me, just didn't do it. I would like to like this stuff because I think if I legitimately liked this album or the Eric Dolphy, I think I get cool, hipster street cred. But I'm not going to put this on, like it's interesting to know about his background and what he was going for. The Coltrane stuff is interesting. I am familiar with Love Supreme, and if I'm not mistaken, that's only got 2 or 3 tracks on it. So, I'm not, but it's just, it's not for me. It's almost, I appreciate the creativeness and his ability, technical performances and all that stuff. This is just a tough listen. But I will say, I credit to him. This is gonna last longer for me than something like Eric Dolphy.
I kind of felt the opposite. Well, I liked Eric Dolphy more. Maybe that was just because I researched him. But
gotcha.
But what was I gonna say? Okay, go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to say, I started off in the montage with Colors, the second track, which is a little bit more straightforward. I have not picked what's going to be, while you're hearing this, you'll have heard what I picked, but I believe that what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for my entry opening montage, I am going to utilize the 2 ostinatos, clips of both of them, to give you an idea of what both the music ostinato as well as the singing ostinato sounds like. And so that'll be my entry clip. So it'll be sort of 2 different pieces. They are not back to back in the track. I think Matt talking about this being like a rainstorm is how I envisioned it too. As you might imagine, Pharoah Sanders didn't really want you to, he wanted you to interpret it in your own headspace, right? But I definitely felt like the first probably about 10 minutes was a prelude to almost like a rainstorm. And if you want to go with the metaphor, into like, exiting from the normal state of consciousness and into a more meditative state. And then it kind of gets a little bit more chaotic with the maracas, the horns, the tambourine, the African percussion. And then around the 26th minute, the ostinatos come back again, the music ones. And it kind of takes you back, almost like transitions you back out of the rainstorm. Two other observations I'd say. Number one is it's interesting we got Eric Dolphy and Pharoah Sanders, because I think there's a lot of jazz in the 60s, and there's a lot of free jazz that's a lot more accessible than this. Like if we had gotten, say, John Coltrane and Miles Davis first before these two, we would basically be talking about like jazz that is, jazz we know of, right? Mm-hmm. But we instead sort of got outgrowths of jazz and areas of free jazz that represent sort of the most experimental elements of jazz. And so it was really an interesting first two jazz albums to get to, because we're going to get to a lot of jazz albums later that are going to be much more, I guess, traditional would be the way to put it.
Accessible.
And so I think these will be very interesting companion pieces when we look at it. The second thing I would say about this is this truly shows me, I think of jazz much more as music that I put in to soak into. And the first time I listened to this, I didn't quite know what I was getting into. And I quickly realized, okay, this is almost like how I have to view it, almost like a guided meditation or, the aesthetic element, right? I had to kind of say, okay, the second time I listen to this, it has to be, I have to prepare myself in an environment where I can listen to this, as opposed to just listening to it interactively, trying to, in my own head, make notes, right? Instead, just let it wash over me. And I will say, as you listen to this that way, the second time, it is a much, much better listen. If you're trying to listen to this and feel how you feel about it, or be in a headspace where in any way you're, processing it cognitively, this album isn't going to listen to you. In that sense, it's sort of like listening to certain industrial music, like, 9 Inch Nails at times. It doesn't sound like 9 Inch Nails, but it's that same idea where sometimes you just let it get into you and kind of see how you feel about it. Or classical music, same idea. And so I enjoyed this much more when I listened to it, almost as if I was doing it as a guided meditation, just without, well, there were words, but, not,
right.
Not many words, more just the ostinato type stuff and repetitiveness. So I would say, I don't know if I'll visit this very often, but if someone were to put this on and I was in the right place, especially in a meditative place, yeah, I liked it. Dolphy, I appreciate the musicianship maybe a little bit more, but at no point did I figure out how it would fit in my life. Like this one, I could see where it would fit in my life. And it actually led me back to Coltrane again. And for me, it was much easier to see where Coltrane led to this than it was with Dolphy on anything but the overblowing, right? But this definitely was, I think, a spiritual predecessor, or successor to Coltrane, if you're familiar with them, especially mid-60s Coltrane. So, yeah, I'd say I can't recommend it necessarily, but I think I definitely liked it more than Josh and Matt did. And not just because I researched it. I definitely this was a grower, not a shower, guys, is how it
Well, I think I think that's an excellent point, John. Because I think it's somewhat true of the Dolphy album. This type of stuff, if you are going to take that leap, so to speak, it is not right. You need to get in the proper headspace. And it's hard to know what that headspace is going into it because you don't know what to expect. So it's almost like you need to listen to it cold just to kind of get an idea of where that would be. And I think that I could totally see what you're saying there, that if this is just something that you kind of wanted to, sit down, maybe even actually meditate, you have this in the background. And, I think that would be a really interesting, experiment, if you will. No, not to say, the elephant in the room being like maybe being, if people are doing drugs, what is that gonna do to this experience? Like
if you had sacred herbs, yes, that would help as well. I believe.
I think I would have a different listening experience if I decided to do some sacred herbs. And so that brings me to that next question, John. Was Pharoah Sanders partaking in the sacred herbs as a musician and or person?
I can't say for sure because it didn't come up as described as part of his ethos a lot. I think a lot of his stuff is what we would know lines up quite a bit with two different things that we would know of, right? Like sort of the rise of Afrocentric music and to some extent world music, right?
Yeah.
And unlike, say, Santana, right, which was doing world, but a very specific type of world music, Pharoah Sanders kind of was like looking at, there were elements of Eastern culture, African culture, but even grounded in American culture with jazz, right? So it's not as defined by a specific cultural experience. I don't think that has anything to do with the drugs, right? And even Native American culture, right? I don't think that he was like, oh, the drug experience is part of that. I think that's more of just that consciousness stuff that you don't have to do any drugs to be a part of that, right? You can, I'll use myself as an example. I do plenty of meditative stuff, and I do not partake in the sacred herbs. So you can do that. But I do think that also, there was the counterculture, and I think he resonated with the counterculture because he was new, he was interesting. The repetitiveness probably, for folks that were under influence, what I mean, could be seen as something that they gave a baseline, and then you have that heightened experience, so you could hear I would just imagine if you were in an altered state, right? You know what I mean? You'd hear those overblows and that the washing sound, and that that sound, the wall of sound type thing that we were talking about, that he used from Coltrane, a lot more. The sheet of sound, excuse me, not the wall of sound, not to mix it up with the production. But yeah, I that's that can be something that those that may listen to this album under the sacred herbs can tell us, what effect it was, or you guys can go into the sacred herbs and listen. But Matt made a great point. Listen to this, even if you don't listen to the whole thing first, to get a feel for what it is, and then create the environment where you think you could partake it. And I'd say you have to go about 15 minutes though, because it takes a pretty violent shift at about the 10-minute mark into a different piece. But once you get there, you'll get a feel for what the two different pieces are. And if you can kind of size that up, then turn it off, find your spot, put it on at the spot you think you'll be able to enjoy it, and see if you can do it.
Yeah, it's kind of it's an experience, right? I mean, more so than any. I mean, you can always put that as a label of anything that you're listening to, but this is really, this is a journey. This is an experience, and it's a different way of listening to music, and that's probably why, at least for me, it's not like, oh man, that's totally resonating with me, because I usually don't listen to music like this or for that purpose. So I do like the fact though that he brings you back. So if you are listening to this and you're kind of being thrown off by the panic and the just the cacophonous noises that are just coming at you from all directions, if you hang in there for a few minutes, he does bring it back, and it does resolve. So, which I appreciated, but this might be something that you have to work on this. If you're used to coming to music from the traditional standard, pop music, rock, blues, R&B, that type of thing. This is a different thing entirely.
Yeah, this is part of the Combing the Stacks journey experience, right? Hearing these albums that we've never heard before, being exposed to things, and there is artistic intent in this album, and he has a definitive mission statement as to what he wants to accomplish, and he did that. And it's unlike anything I've experienced before, as I said, and you got to experience it for yourself.
Sure. And I think also, and I'll kind of end with this, I think one of the cool things will be, as we continue to delve into types of music, we heard Matt earlier tonight say, I'm kind of getting my soul in R&B PhD and really liking it. All of us, I think, are kind of getting into free jazz experience. We have a little bit more experience with other types of jazz, but free jazz, not as much. And there's going to be other stuff that, I know you've heard Josh say a couple times, I've never heard of this band. A lot of the psych for me is brand new. So I think that's cool. And I think we'll be able to sort of over time perhaps revisit some of this stuff. And maybe if we don't change our opinion of it, we might be able to build it into the context of all we learn over many, many episodes, which is something I think that's going to be really cool.
John, would you say that this is, because I was trying to figure out when I was listening to it, what I would call it, like what's it reminding me of, and the terms like Eastern music, world music kind of came up. Was that is that, I don't know what world music is. I know the term, but I don't know if I know exactly what that is. Is this anywhere in that realm, or is that something totally different as far as you know?
Yeah, it's still considered free jazz, although it's important to note that while it seems unusual to us, I think it was considered pretty in the context of the free jazz that was being created. And you have to remember, you got the Dolphys, the Thelonious Monks that are really sort of ripping up the game plan, right? And doing it totally different. it was considered to be more of a traditional jazz piece, right? In terms of certain things, because there is a certain structure to the playing and techniques that are used in jazz. I mean, we were able to, the glissandos, stuff like that, that are in jazz, right? But yeah, this would be world music, and world music really is just defined as music that brings in a variety of sounds from across the world, and like I said before, this would be it, and it became really trendy, right? In like the 80s when Peter Gabriel and Paul Simon, right? They
I sense some disdain in your tone there, John.
And then, and then Sting, and stuff like that. And a lot of people love it, but it's kind of, they would just bring people in. I think the disdain you're hearing is because sometimes I wasn't always sure how organic that was.
Yeah.
You can't say that Pharoah Sanders is
no, that's true. That's true.
I think that he's a guy. So yeah, so it's free jazz with elements of world music built in, and certainly, you can see the Sun Ra influence because it's even like a little bit of the jam. The joke about the jam bands, they can stay on one, guitar part for 6 to 7 minutes. There's elements of that in this as well.
Well, no, I think I think that if that's the definition of world music, then I think this definitely is it. One thing I was thinking, I just remembered that it's almost like I felt like if I was in like Epcot Center and World Showcase, like where would I be hearing this music? And I'm like, I'd be in every freaking country, maybe except Canada.
Yep.
Like it's like it's every country. It'd be it's very eclectic in that regard.
Well, and his spiritualism is eclectic. I mean, like I said, his two biggest things. One is the biggest concept in the Islamic faith, which is obviously the most worldwide, right? You know what I mean? The Islamic faith is practiced, I think, in the largest number of folks and in the most countries in the world, right? You know what I mean? And so that makes sense. It's while it's a Middle Eastern religion, right? It also has strong, roots in, North America, Asia, Africa, so it makes sense. And then the other concept of karma, right, is from India. And once again, another huge country with also, and there was in Europe and in the United States and Canada, there was, there was a huge increase in the amount of people who had Eastern sensibilities in the late 60s, right? You know what I mean? And so they were looking to India. I mean, how many bands do we know went to India to, gain insight, right?
The Beatles
so
did.
You're tapping into some of this.
Yes,
the Beatles did.
And you know what? They were
know.
the first ones to do it, and everybody followed them there.
Enough.
So that was another thing.
Enough. We already are covering 15 Beatles albums. I just can't. No more. We're plenty of time to talk about that. But anyway, let me wrap it up right now because we're